I started out really as a disc jockey in Washington, D.C., and I had collected a bunch of Jamaican 45s when I went to Jamaica first in 1977. And someone suggested I do a radio show. So I talked to a station in the DC area. I took on the name Dr. Dread, and I had a show called Night of the Living Dread. And then I thought, how can I spread reggae music even further? And in about 1983, I had written a few songs and was going to Jamaica regularly and met an artist named Peter Broggs and sang him some of my songs. And he said, let's do an album together. So we got the Roots Radix band together and went to Channel One on Maxfield Avenue in Kingston and made the first album of Ross Records, which was called Rastafari Liveth. He's actually from, you know, Western Jamaica, from Lucy, and he was good brethren with Bongo, who lives in the grill, who is pretty well known for having the best weed in Jamaica. And I think there were times he was even shipping it out of Jamaica. And he's still alive. He's still a good friend. So Broggs and Bongo were really tight brethren. And Bongo actually put up half the money to make this album and came to Kingston. You know, he was living in the grill. He still lives in the grill. And so Broggs eventually moved to Kingston and lived in the Camperdown Road area, and people would smoke chalice there. And, he was just kind of a downtown roots Rasta man. And, we made a connection. And eventually he moved to Washington, D.C., to where I was living. So, Broggs is no longer with us. But, I think together we did like 3 to 4 to 5 albums.
And you also had a close relationship with the Melodians during that time as well, right?
Yeah, The Melodians was the third album I put out. It was my second production where I actually took them in the recording studio in DC. And, up to that point, I was just heavy into spreading the message of Rastafari. But what the Melodians explained to me is that, you can't be too serious about life all the time, that sometimes music makes you want to have a good time and dance, and it can't just be all about message and serious something. So they kind of opened up that idea to me, and I really got along great with them as brethren. And actually Brent Dow, one of the singers, called me from Jamaica one day and he said, hey, Doc, I've opened up a record store on Slipe Road where Tony Robinson used to have his shop. Tony Robinson produced U Roy and the Gladiators and did a bunch of great records. And he said, guess what the name of the store is? And I said, what's that? He said, I call it Ross Records. So, some people, they might want to sue somebody for that, but I took it as a compliment. Brent was my friend. We were working together, and he even started pressing records, 45s on the Ross label in Jamaica. And this is, the mid 80s, I would say. We had a song called Sugar Daddy by Michigan and Smiley. That
Yeah.
went to number one. I think we sold over 20,000 copies in Jamaica just of
Oh,
that single.
your second release was Freddie
No, that was
McGregor.
Freddie McGregor, Come On Over. But that record was produced by Linville Thompson, so I didn't really have anything to do with the production of it. But I had signed Freddie McGregor to a 3 album deal. I was thinking maybe he was the next Bob Marley. And, I just loved his vibes and his voice. And, that Studio One album he did, Bobby Babylon. And then, of course, Big Ship for Greensleeves. So, we put out Come On Over was our second release. We were just a small company, and I got an order out of England for 1,000 copies of the vinyl, which like totally blew my mind. And then a week later, they called me back and wanted 1,000 more. So, Ross Records, we got off to a good little start as a label. I also owned a distribution company where we distributed all the other reggae labels from all over the world.
For a time, you were the only one distributing Bob Marley albums in the US.
Yeah, sadly, when Bob Marley died, we had been importing Bob Marley records from Tough Gong, and Bob was switching labels. So this young Ross Records, it was literally in the basement of my house. We had shelves and shelves of Bob Marley records, and everybody found out, even record store chains across America, and they were buying loads and loads of Bob Marley from us. And it really helped to grow the company. And, in those days, for I think a year, basically all I did was pack up vinyl into boxes and ship them out all over America. I was good friends with Mr. Dodd Coxome, the owner of Studio One. We were the largest distributor of Studio One records in the world, and he was based in Brooklyn, New York, on Fulton Street. So, we would talk and hang out. And I remember one day he was driving me back from Brooklyn to Manhattan in his station wagon, and he and I were smoking a joint. And I said, Mr. Dodd, what gives that Studio One sound that's so special? I said, like, is it the treble? That you got that treble sound to it? And he just thought for a moment. He said, Dr. Dredd, I would have to say that it's God, which I thought was a pretty profound statement. So, due to our close relationship, I suggested we release some records with him. And so I came up with the name Rosso, the real authentic sound of Studio One. And I think we put out a few albums and a bunch of singles, and we were going to do some cassettes, but then certain artists, they weren't in favor of that. So it was kind of short-lived. And my whole mission in starting the label was to bring people that real authentic sound of Jamaica instead of a bunch of watered down, things that were coming out on like the Trojan record label.
The next one I would love to speak on is Israel Vibration.
Yeah, well, I consider Israel Vibration the cornerstone of Ross Records. They had broke up, they moved to New York. Two of them had put out some solo releases, Apple and Wiss. And they called me and they said, we want you to sign us to Ross Records as solo artists separately. And I told them that, Marcus Garvey said that unity is strength. And if they got back together, because I love them as a group, love them, their music, that I would, sign them as Israel Vibration. So they told me to come up to Brooklyn to meet with them at this like Ital Jamaican restaurant. So I drove the 6 hours, and then they never showed up, and I hung out and hung out. Eventually got in my car and drove home. And then I'm like, so what's up? And they're like, well, we had a show in California. We forgot. And I said, well, here's the deal. I've got the Roots Radix in Washington, D.C. Next week, I will buy you 3 plane tickets. If you get on the plane, then we'll be working together. And if you don't get on the plane, we won't be. They showed up, brought him to Lion and Fox Studio. we recorded the album Strength of My Life. And I like to think that, the rest is history of a really close, long relationship where Ross Records would tour them all over the world. And, they got a really big following and people just love them.
Was it true that there was tension between Skelly and Apple, which was what made Apple leave the group?
Yeah, I would say there was tension between Skelly and Apple big time, and less tension between Apple and Wiss because Wiss is just so laid back and mellow.
Yeah.
And so, again, I try to sort it out and help them work through their differences. I went to New York and had them all come to my hotel and talk things out. But, sometimes things just don't work out. So the group eventually, Apple left the group and then Wiss and Skelly continued on as Israel Vibration. Yeah, well, I called it the power of the Trinity. And, there's a lot of Jamaican trios. And what made Israel Vibration so exceptional is that each one was a lead singer and that they would take turns at the mic. The first time I saw them live in San Francisco, I literally started crying, seeing them come on stage with their crutches as polio victims and each one, taking the lead and, changing it up between the three of them. It was just a phenomena that you'll never experience again. And even to this day, that music holds up. Culture, Joseph Hill is one of the most incredible artists to ever come out of Jamaica. And, the way he looked at the world and, saw things and then was able to articulate that in song, just made him, one of the more interesting, phenomenal people. And Joseph and I were brothers for real. We were very, very close. And I would spend time at his home in Jamaica. I'm still very close with his wife and his kids. And, he was just a really giving, loving person. And, we lost him very young, unfortunately. But yeah, he's one of the great, great reggae artists of all time. Well, I'm not good with years, but I think our first release with Culture was Good Things. So I don't know what year it came out because I don't really keep track of years, but I know that was the first record.
And was that just like a one-off at that time, and then he later signed to Rass?
Yeah, that I was in Jamaica and there was someone there from Israel named Gil Bonstein who was close with Joseph. And so they were recording the album at Dynamics, I believe. And I said, they asked if I wanted to put it out. I said, of course. So they came to Washington, D.C., and we mixed it. And there's some dub versions on there. And that's what actually began my relationship with Culture. And I think the One Stone followed the Good Things. And that thing was a monster. That thing sold so much that led into Payday, which, I gave him in advance of more money than I ever gave anyone, because One Stone did so well. And he built this beautiful home with a studio in the hills above Jamaica, and I remember going there and he said, Dr. Dredd, you built this home for me. And I was like so proud to just sit there and see he had this beautiful place and feeling good. And, a lot of these artists for me, they were like family and they still are
Mhm.
40 some years later.